So before we get started, I also want to acknowledge the passing of Martha Grace. Martha was, I guess, our oldest alumna. She joined the program after retiring from the Chief Justiceship of the juvenile court system in Massachusetts and came to the MAP program because she was always interested in animals. Originally, she had wanted to be a veterinarian, but at the time that she was applying, she was denied because she was married. And so she went to law school instead and had a very distinguished legal career. And so she, in addition to doing the MAP program, she also then became an important member of our community. She taught the animal law class for a number of years, as well as being part of our advisory board and showing up to all kinds of center events, and we really miss her. So anyway, on that note, I also want to acknowledge the sponsorship of the Animal Matters series by the Lawrence Endowed Fund. Thank you. That fund sponsors all our Animal Matters series, as well as a series of grants and community service functions that are very important to the school. So anyway, today's speaker is Elizabeth MeLampy. Elizabeth is deeply rooted in Cumming School, and we're glad to have her back. It feels very nice to have you here. She went to Harvard College, then did her law school at Harvard Law, was active in the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program, where we also have a number of colleagues and friends, and did a couple of clerkships before and worked for, was it EDF? An RDC, as a environmental advocate, and has before setting out on writing her book. And so we're really excited to hear her talk about her book, and we're happy to have you back in our community here.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to be talking about this topic, which I spent years working on, and I think is a really fun and interesting and exciting way to think about animals in a way that a lot of us haven't yet. You know, we're all people who think about animals all the time. I know especially a lot of you in this room, but animal festivals are sort of kind of an exciting place to push some of the boundaries of what we assume to be true about animals. So before I dive into the content of the book and sort of tell you a little bit about the research and the festivals, I just kind of wanted to tell you a little more about who I am and how I got interested in animal issues in the first place. So my grandmother was an anthropologist who studied human-animal relationships. She was also a veterinarian. I grew up really steeped in this world of caring about animals in sort of a twofold way. One, scientific, you know, she was a veterinarian. She understood, you know, all of the scientific things that comes with that degree. And the other is much more kind of spiritual, almost symbolic. Like, what are we saying about animals when we talk about animals? And so at the center of those two poles, I sort of, you know, became an adult learning about all of these things, hearing about the way that she wrote and thought and talked about animals. She taught here at Tufts for many years, and she was fascinated by many of the same questions that students here are asking today as well. My grandmother wrote more than a few books about human-animal relationships. She focused mainly on like symbolism that we attach to animals in these stories that we tell, and the complex dynamics between humans and animals, mainly in the American West, but all over the world captured her interest. My grandmother died when I was 9 years old, so I never got to talk to her about any of this as an adult. This is, in many ways, a project of kind of recreating what I think she might have eventually kind of gotten to had we been able to have an adult conversation about these things. But this whole time I was growing up, I was just, you know, a kid who was raised to love animals and care about the natural world. I didn't find my own way to interact with animals and nature until I went to law school myself. In law school, I took a class called animal law. I just sort of thought it sounded interesting. I learned about how the law treats different animals so differently, depending on which animal they are, what they're being used for, what context they live in. And I was sort of amazed at what a broad and varied world existed out there in animal law. You know, lawyers love to pride themselves on being logical and reasonable and sort of like rooting their arguments in rationality and those types of really kind of arguments you hear again and again. And in the animal law classroom, I saw some of those norms falling apart. I saw, you know, things to me that seemed to have some logical fallacies in them. Why would we treat one animal one way in one context and treat that exact same animal differently in a different context? Some of those questions started to kind of like pick at me a little, you know? And I was just surprised at how broad of a world. So I just put like a smattering of topics that you might come across in an animal law class. It's really quite broad. And what I began to see was sort of a mess of stories and myths and assumptions and norms that we tell ourselves about animals that underlie all of these laws. So, you know, the laws were sort of codifying these stories that we tell about animals in our daily lives in all sorts of different contexts in which we encounter them. I had studied religion in undergrad, so I was trained in a different way to ask those questions. You know, what's the story underlying this? What's the meaning behind this? You know, why are we telling ourselves these exact things? When I graduated law school, I was clerking for a judge and doing all sorts of research into non-animal things, not as fun. And I found myself really missing the complexity of studying animals and animal law. It was around this time, it was like COVID years, that my parents unearthed a few boxes of my grandmother's old materials. We kind of picked through it together. It had kind of an unbelievable amount of stuff, like file folders filled with notes, article clippings, old Post-it notes, like business cards from businesses that are defunct now, like just a smattering of stuff from my grandmother's research in the 80s and 90s. Before my grandmother died, she was working on what would have been a book about animal festivals. She had started to travel and explore some of these events around the world, events that use animals as part of their celebrations. When she was working on this, she was planning more of like an academic anthology. And, you know, she kind of wanted, I think, to pull together some of these ways that humans use symbols and rituals to talk about it in an anthropological sense. You know, why are humans doing this? Was a question that I think bothered her in her research as well. But she passed away before she could finish this project. And so these notes kind of sat in some boxes for 30 years until I rolled along. And when I started picking through it, my curiosity was piqued. You know, I was in law school learning all of this stuff, learning kind of the rigid world of law and how it applied and how it made real impact on animals' lives. And then in this box was this sort of like treasure trove of all of these ways that humans interact with animals, kind of at the threshold of where symbols and reality meet. And so I thought it was a really exciting project, and I just didn't know what was left of it. So I started like Googling, because that's what we all do if we don't know what to do. And I made kind of like a spreadsheet of these events that I found in her boxes, you know, like what ones were still happening. 30 years had passed. I figured some of these events would have stopped occurring or would have changed, or every single event but one was still happening. Most of them were bigger. Most of them had now had social media followings attached to them. These events were still really an important part of these communities that were putting them on every year. When I made this spreadsheet, I realized that there was an event in like a month from when I had done this work. And so I decided to try to go. I had no idea what I was doing. I had never done like a research trip before. I wasn't trained as an anthropologist, but I had a sense that seeing something on the ground, seeing how these people in these communities put on an event the way my grandmother would have walked through those same floors and seen it, would help me understand something else about this work that she had started. The Scopes Trial Play and Festival takes place in Tennessee, and it focuses on a reenactment of the Scopes Trial, which took place 100 years ago this year in 1925. John Scopes was prosecuted for teaching evolution in a biology classroom. At the time, it was illegal to teach evolution in the state of Tennessee. His trial was highly publicized. This was like the first trial that was published, that was broadcast on radio. There were news outlets all over the country were covering this trial. Legal and political giants were on both sides of the case, fighting it out in the courtroom. And it was it was a huge deal then, and I think it continues to be something that we turn back to in pop culture and in media again and again as the years have gone on. This clash between evolution and religion, this clash between religion and science is sort of has an abiding power. In Dayton, Tennessee today, every year they put on a reenactment of this trial. The 7-day trial they condense into about an hour and a half, but still they get all the salient points across, and they sort of put on the show for the community. This evolution debate at the core of this trial was fascinating for many reasons that still reverberate today. So core disputes like fundamentalism versus progressivism, or religion versus science, local control versus national control. These are things we're all hearing about in the news today. But there's another question underlying the Scopes trial that I came back to again and again as I was listening to the language of the trial and reading the history about it. It's actually not only about whether evolution, like teaching evolution, should be illegal. The trial and the sort of hype about evolution in this era was specifically about whether we should be teaching that humans evolved from animals. It's slightly different. No one particularly got fired up if we started talking about a wolf evolving into a dog. That we could understand that in some sort of theoretical, hypothetical way that didn't threaten us. What the evolution debate seemed to be most angry about, most contentious about, was the suggestion that humans were part of that scheme. It's that humans were connected to animals. We were evolved from animals. That piece of it was the piece that I kept seeing like little sparks of it in the actual words that they were saying at this trial and in the actual words of the law. Religious defenders, at this time would say things like, humans are more than animals, right? We are ensouled. We're special. We're created in God's image. And having humans attached to animals in that way threatens something kind of core in who we are as humans. And people who aren't religious would also say something similar, about how humans are special. We have logic. We have language. We have capacities for reason. We are different in some core fundamental way. But science at the other side was beginning to prove that humans were also animals. We came from animals. We share a lot of DNA with animals. The science of evolution was starting to threaten some of those core assumptions about human supremacy. And the evolution debate, I think, is not a sidetrack to the animal festivals, which I'll get to in a second. I think it really even though there were no animals present at this festival today when I went, or a few years ago when I went, it still has this, I think, core question of how do animals relate to our own stories about who we are as humans? How do we define who we are on this planet as humans when we have animals all around us all the time? And so this, I think, was the most kind of heady and philosophical answer to that question. And I think the other festivals that I'll go through in a little bit have a more tangible and a more kind of concrete answer to that question. But it's all sort of about thinking through these stories of who we are as humans that we've told for millennia and whether those are the right stories to be telling anymore because they have impacts on animals. So the Scopes trial was the first festival I visited. It was the first one I tried. I was so excited to keep doing this work, to keep sort of following my grandmother's footsteps. I had her, of course, because she was a trained scientist and anthropologist, she had dozens and dozens of pages of trip notes from her trip, so I could follow her itineraries fairly accurately, which was, so I think personally fulfilling, and also for the project of kind of studying these festivals offered a very unique lens because I had now a 30-year window of research. It wasn't just my own insights from 2022, 23 when I was doing this travel. I also had insights from 1988, 1990, 1994. I had these opportunities to kind of get a glimpse into what had changed, what had stayed the same, all of that. So the Scopes trial ultimately became the conclusion of the book that I ended up writing from all of this work. For the first time after the Scopes trial, I thought maybe I could finish my grandmother's book. It's like a very scary thought because, my grandmother was such a giant in the field of human-animal relationships. She really had a lot of, I think, original kind of, she was one of the people who really helped this field get going. And I wasn't an anthropologist. Like I said, I was trained totally differently. I took some of anthropology classes in college, but it's not the same thing as like being trained. And I decided that I was just going to kind of take this one chapter at a time, right? Like one event at a time and see what happened. My background as a lawyer helped me really rigorously think through these festivals. What was happening? Why? Why was it legal? Why are we allowing this? Those sorts of like concrete questions that are practical. I could access that. My background as a student of religion encouraged me to ask some of those same questions about meaning I was talking about earlier, why, the why behind the what. And then, like all of you, my background as a human who cares about animals, I think helped me when I went to all of these events, not just focus on the human entertainment value, but kind of turn to the animals and say, what's their experience of this event like? Does this benefit them at all? If not, why are we doing it? What's the best argument for putting an animal in that position? And there are good arguments, which I'll talk about. And I think thinking through all of those pieces is what I hope to bring to this work. So I started to do some research. So I began to track animal festivals. Whenever I heard of one, I would keep it in a spreadsheet and try to sort of understand what was going on. Like, why were so many of these events happening all over the country? I'll define my definition of animal festival. There may be others, but what I have been using is basically in any event, any local event or big event that uses an animal as sort of like the centerpiece of the event. So sometimes that's literal. There like is an animal in the middle of the event. Sometimes it's like a celebration about an animal, but when the concept of an animal being the part of the celebration that is relevant. And as I did more of this research, I was like totally stunned to find that there's like dozens and dozens and dozens of these all over the United States. Some are really small. Some are like a few thousand people kind of in a small town doing something very local. Others are kind of nationally known, bring 40, 50, sometimes 60,000 people. It depends kind of on the place and the topic. But I think a map like this shows the like abiding appeal of using animals in this sort of symbolic and sort of ritual-based way. As I was kind of trying to get my hands around all of those festivals, I began to see some patterns emerge. What we were doing at these events kind of started to fall into categories for me. Sometimes festivals are, they're meant to demonstrate dominance over an animal. So, numerous events exist around the country where animals are being killed, sometimes after being captured or tortured. And those festivals, I think it's really clear to see what's going on. A wishy-washier category, for lack of a better word, is humor. Sometimes festivals are just meant to be a good time. They're meant to be funny. They're meant to, have us get a good laugh out of an animal, either because the animal's doing something funny, because we're putting the animal in sort of like a weird, incongruous position, or because, humans find humor in all sorts of things and there's really not a good reason. But that humor category I found to be really interesting. And then lastly, I found a lot of festivals that were reverential towards animals, that put an animal up on a pedestal and said, this animal is worth our special attention. It's worth our care. We should, do something about this, raise some awareness, raise some education, those types of things. In the end, I focused on 8 festivals in the book that I found to be paradigmatic examples of some of those broader categories, broader trends. So they're represented on this map by the little icon of which animal they are in the place geographically where they exist. And the book as a whole, I put it in that order: dominance, humor, reverence. And I hope to sort of ask some questions about what it might be like to move towards a vision of reverence for animals, move towards a world where we're not using animals solely for our entertainment at their expense, but where we're really kind of thinking through what this interspecies world might look like in a more compassionate future. So I'm going to show you just some highlights from the book because I think it really brings it to life to see some photos and videos from these events, just so you can get a flavor for what they are and how they operate. So the first section of the book, and the place that I think is easiest to start, hardest maybe emotionally, but easiest I think as we think about a paradigm for treating animals in a certain way, is dominance. The first festival in the dominance section is the Rattlesnake Roundup in Sweetwater, Texas. So this is an event where hunters go out for weeks before the festival, gathering snakes from the surrounding environment, rattlesnakes. and they bring them into this arena that they call the Coliseum. And during the roundup weekend, the point of the event is to kill all of the snakes. It's sort of the nominal point of the rattlesnake roundup is to keep rattlesnake populations in check in the area. And so this photo here is of the skinning pit, kind of before crowds got too busy. So at the height of the festival, which I won't show you because some of the footage and videos are a little bloody and gory. So that whole area is covered with people. The stands behind them are covered with people. It's a pretty popular event. And so I will show you a video. So this is the pit of snakes that have been captured. And I'll show you a video of the handler. Well, you get the picture. That's very loud. I'm sorry. And yeah, so that, I think the snakes existed in that pit for the weekend, and throughout the weekend, the organizers would pull them out kind of one by one and behead them on this stump here. And then they would skin the snake and separate the snake skin itself would get sold like as a souvenir. The muscle would get deep fried. There's a deep fryer in behind the building and sold to visitors as kind of like a novelty snack. And this event, you know, it was very popular. Like 40, 50,000 people kind of came over the course of the weekend. They call this they self-proclaim to be the world's largest rattlesnake roundup. And it's just, you know, I think an event that to many people seems kind of hard to think about, hard to watch. Like this doesn't seem quite right. And I see a lot of faces in here kind of being, you know, upset at this idea of glorifying the killing of these snakes. And lots of advocates and scientists are fighting this, and there's a lot of work being done. But this event, I think, is a hard place to start, but it is a very clear example of us taking an animal from the wild, using it for our purpose. This event's like 65, 67, maybe now years old. They've been doing it a long time. It really harkens back to this like frontier past of, you know, man against wilderness, like that idea they really invoke here. The second festival in the Dominance Festival, in the Dominance section, is the Maine Lobster Festival. So totally different vibes. But I think that, you know, there's a lot that actually ties it in common to the Rattlesnake Roundup. This event supports the Maine lobster industry, and its focal point is serving up lobster meals. So the center of the event is the world's largest lobster cooker, this like collection of 8 vats of boiling water. And they are cooking lobsters kind of constantly, and then they will bring them to the food tent where the line is like out to the street and people are buying lobster dinners. So I grew up in New England. Like I've enjoyed many lobster dinners in my lifetime. And I think when I got to this event, there's something in me that was much more comfortable with this presentation of animal killing, right? It's like, it just is something that I have been socialized to my whole life. But as I thought more and more about this event and thought where to put it in the book, I realized it's actually very similar to the Rattlesnake Roundup. In both events, animals are taken from the wild, brought in alive in mass. They're killed in public, in the view of the public, in potentially painful ways. And then the point of the event is to engage with the flesh, with the bodies of these animals after they die. So the tone is really different between these two events. The sort of aesthetics of the events are really different, but there's a lot in common. And so there's an aspect of dominance in that relationship with these animals that I thought was really worth interrogating. The humor section starts off with the international camel and ostrich races in Virginia City, Nevada. These races are not for speed. They're not like serious races. They're more like riding a mechanical bull. The point of these each heat of races around the track is to just hold on, the longest. And so these animals don't make that very easy. They don't particularly want to be ridden. They are animals who, you know, they're not designed to have a human on their back. The camels, so this is like their starting chutes, sort of as they go out. The photos of this event are hard because of the bars. It's just like the reality of going to some of these events. But here's a photo of the ostrich races. So the humans ride right on the back of the ostriches. On the back, in the background, you can see an ostrich who, like, the rider had flown over the ostrich's head, and the ostrich was skidding onto its chest. And then in the foreground, a rider's about to fall off an ostrich backwards. So I kind of got to this event, and was not expecting quite so much danger, but there's actually like people get hurt at this event all the time. Animals get hurt. It's an event that really peddles that slapstick humor. So the point of this event is that kind of hilarity that comes when you watch someone fall and have a massive wipeout. Like that was what was happening here. And everyone around me was cracking up, cheering. Like this was an event that brought a lot of joy to the families who came and attended this event. And so that slapstick humor idea, I think is one that helps root this humor section. Slapstick's one variety of humor that I think is, it's close to dominance, right? There is an aspect of this where we're using these animals to sort of like just to use them for our purposes. But it also is something more. We're not killing these animals. We're not torturing them. We have some respect for them. These animals have a home and they're taken care of. And there's something else going on here. The Camel Festival is where the book gets its title. So the title of the book is Forget the Camel. During one of these heats where these 3 riders were riding around the track, a jockey fell off the back of a camel, 6 or 7 feet to the ground, and was sort of just lying there. And the handlers of the animals were rushing to control the camel. They were trying to get him like back under control, back to the start line, back to safety. And the MC of the event kind of was constantly announcing what he was witnessing during the races. He said into the microphone, "Check on Charlie. Forget the camel." Excuse me. And Charlie was this man who had fallen off, and he was lying there, kind of on the ground. And the camel was getting all this attention. And so when that announcer said, "Forget the camel, like check on the human," I was sort of it just seemed to me to be a microcosm of the whole book, of the whole project of animal festivals, which is where we take an animal, we put it at the center, we say, this is what we're doing. We're doing camel races. These are about camels. But we can't actually think too hard about the camels, or that event starts to feel not great. If you start thinking about what the camel's feeling at all of these events, all of these heats, and it was a hot day. It was they're doing this again and again. If you start to think about what the lobster or the snake or the other animals I'll talk about soon start to feel, it becomes like you can't do both. So these animal festivals both foreground animals and kind of purposefully force them into the background. I just thought it was a good way to summarize all of that work about animal festivals. The second humor festival is the Jumping Frog Jubilee, which is based off of a short story by Mark Twain. So this is a totally different type of humor than the slapstick humor of the camel and ostrich races. This humor is like almost subtle. It's almost serious. It's like it's a type of humor that's meant to sort of like be ridiculous in its own right, but you don't want to say it's ridiculous. And that is exactly what you saw here, is you saw people doing a very silly thing very seriously. And that kind of had its own charm to it. So for those of you who don't know, because I didn't know, frog jumping is a sport where these frogs get 3 jumps from the beginning starting pad to the end of the 3rd jump. That distance is measured. Longest distance wins. So you'll see here the like referees are pulling out a measuring tape to see how far that frog had gotten. So it might be loud again, and I apologize, but I'll show you a video of a frog jump just so you can see. You want to turn it down? Thank you. Like magic.
Sure. Candy. And if you're new to the audience, Logan actually won this about 4 years ago. Good first jump, good second.
So that's a frog jump. And as you can see, these frogs are so they're placed on the starting pad, and then how they are made to jump, they're not trained. There's no it's not like training a dog where you give them a treat. They're scared, right? These people, they come behind them, they stomp at them, they clap. They clap at them. They like do all sorts of things to get the frog to go into that fight or flight response. And it's not laugh out loud. Like I didn't, crack up at that. It's not the same as the camel humor, but there's something kind of quirky here, something kind of odd that that these people doing this very silly thing are okay. And so even if the animals aren't dying, it's these two. Do I have another photo? No. These two examples of humor festivals, I think, show that there's something going on with humor. I think it's the most interesting part of the book, actually. It was the hardest to write, and I think the most interesting to research, because this section is, I think, using humor as a way to distance us from animals, right? It's a way to say, we don't actually need to know what's going on because this isn't that serious. We're not killing them. We don't need to worry about their sort of health or wellness or safety because that's not the point. This is all for fun and games. And that fun and games attitude can really mask a lot of hurt that happens to animals. And I think that, it's a different attitude at these events. Like every event that you see, and I'm sure you've all maybe been to animal festivals or had some in your hometown, they all have a vibe, right? Like for lack of a better word, they all have a sort of spirit to them that are really different. And these two were good natured. It was like meant to be a fun family afternoon. And I think there's something in that that prevents us from engaging seriously with what's actually happening to the animals. The last section of the book and the last sort of category of animal festivals that I looked at is reverence. And I'll start by showing you exactly how the festivities in Groundhog Day in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania began. Yes, that is them singing the word groundhog. Groundhog Day was like one of the strangest and most fun events that I went to while working on this book. It's a hugely popular event. This event not only brings 40 or 50,000 people to this very small town in Pennsylvania, but it also is something that's kind of televised all over the country, right? Like I grew up seeing what happened, whether Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow on the morning of February 2nd every year. And this event it starts at 3 a.m. It's this kind of 4-hour massive pre-dawn party with fireworks, with live music, sort of dancing, people dress up as Phil, the whole thing. And around 7 a.m., Phil actually makes his prediction when the sun actually rises. And this event certainly has aspects of humor to it, right? Like this is ridiculous. And they know, like the organizers know this is ridiculous. They don't take themselves very seriously in what they're doing. But at the same time, I think it belongs in the reverence section because Phil is what we're celebrating. We're not celebrating groundhogs. So Phil is a real celebrity. You can book a cameo with Phil on that app Cameo if you want. There's meet and greets with him throughout the year. He has his own social media. Phil is a real, as an individual, is a real celebrity. And Phil is also a character. He's someone he's immortal, by the way, and he lives as this idea of Punxsutawney Phil. But of course, a real groundhog plays Phil. There's a real groundhog doing this every single year. And so this individual groundhog who spends his day in this plexiglass tube, he gets ferried around and held up for selfies and photo ops. There's something deeply reverential going on here. Like that is something really different than what we saw in the frog jumping contest or in the camel races, where that was just sort of this like en masse interaction with this kind of species for the purpose of humor. This is all about Phil. People dressed up as Phil. People wore leggings with his face on it. I wore a hat. I won a hat in a contest and therefore had to wear it of Phil, of Phil's like face on my head. It looked like a toilet plunger. But there's something, this is different is what I'm trying to get at than that humor. There's certainly aspects of humor to it, but what's going on here, this adoration of Phil, I think is worth investigating. Especially given that groundhogs typically are pests, right? They're not animals who get a lot of care in our society. In fact, the morning of Groundhog Day, it was like 2 a.m. We were driving from our hotel to the area where the prognostication occurs. We saw 2 dead groundhogs on the road that had been hit by cars. And that, it was just this like sort of, I think, juxtaposition of the care that we give animals kind of in a routine everyday sense and the care that we give Phil, this one animal, on this special day that we dedicate to him. And I think there's something really interesting there in terms of how we relate to animals when we revere them. Are we actually revering the animal or revering something else that we're using the animal to play? The last event in this section is the sweetest event of the book. The Butterfly Days Parade and Festival in Pacific Grove, California, basically celebrates the return of the migrating monarch butterflies to their town. It's a very quaint event. This is a really small town thing. The kindergartners in their local school district get the honor of dressing up as the monarchs. They make their own costumes. The preschoolers dress up like the caterpillars. They also make their own costumes. It's adorable. And, you know, this, I think, offers a way to think about an animal festival that isn't rooted in exploitation, but that is rooted in that kind of reverence for reverence's sake. So there's no monarchs at this festival. You know, they don't bring them in. They don't sort of use the actual animal. What they're doing is celebrating a natural behavior of an animal, and they focus on things like education and conservation and things like that. So I think ending with that felt like you can see this trajectory of how we engage with different species, how we engage with different animals, ending in this place of hope. Not every festival falls neatly into those categories that I just laid out. I wish they did. It would like make things easier if there was just those three, but a lot of festivals have aspects of multiple categories, right? Like we engage with animals in really complex ways, depending on so many things like culture, tradition, heritage, species, stories, all of those things I mentioned. And the Iditarod Dogsled Race is an example that captures, kind of blends these categories. So I just want to leave you with this. The Iditarod, for those who don't know, is a 1,000-mile dog sled race through rural Alaska, where a single team of dogs runs the whole thing in over a week. It takes over a week. The race has been criticized over the years for its poor treatment of dogs. So over 150 dogs have passed away in the history of the race. Even the dogs that live often suffer really strenuous injuries or kind of like life-changing, life-threatening chronic conditions after the race, lung conditions, et cetera. So in this way, when you start like looking at the animal cruelty piece of this can start looking a lot like dominance, right? We're using an animal for our own purposes just because, like we can talk about the just because, the why, but we're using an animal sort of not thinking about what's happening to the animal. But the Iditarod is also undeniably this kind of like beautiful romantic event that people love. People love this event and they love mushing dogs. When you travel anywhere within the state of Alaska, you'll see dogs, like images of dogs, mushing dogs. There's this real, I think, care and adoration for what it is that these dogs do, because everyone knows it's hard. It's not that they don't think this is a really hard event for the dogs. I think there's this respect for them that they are able to undergo it. And that respect for these dogs, I think, is individual. The mushers really love their dogs, but it's also cultural. It's like the Alaskan heritage, this idea that that grit that got them to sort of sustain livelihoods in Alaska is at play here in these dogs now. So that makes it look a lot more like a reverential festival where we're putting these dogs into a place where we can all take photos of them and take selfies with them and really kind of experience that world of the dogs with them. But lastly, while the Iditarod is about to start, there's a lot of other festivities taking place in Anchorage, Alaska. This is the annual running of the reindeer, where humans and reindeers race each other down the street. So here's your humor, right? This is obviously funny. So you can see like all three of these things were happening on the exact same day. We had dogs being loved, dogs being abused, reindeer being like, who knows what their lives are like before and after this race, but like this is funny. Like there's just like, it's such a mess when you start thinking about these categories and how they blend and overlap in our world. Nevertheless, I think the categories are really helpful starting points for how to think about animals. These animal festivals, like I said, they don't always fit those categories, but they really are, I think, fruitful places to start interrogating how we think about animals more generally. Animal festivals exist at the crossroads of our symbolic and practical lives, right? They both tell these stories about our heritage, our traditions, our cultures, our communities, and they affect real animals, they affect real creatures. And I think those two kind of opposing poles is what makes them so interesting. I also want to say that every single one of these festivals brings real benefits to real humans. You know, I kind of glossed over the why in a lot of this, what I just gave you, because, you know, a presentation like this is a short time to get it all across. But the broad strokes of the why is these events are all rooted in local history. They're all something that people care about deeply. They grew up hearing about these stories. They grew up in these communities where They, they went to these festivals as a kid. Every one of these festivals has lasted dozens and dozens of years, some up to 100 years. There's a real kind of lore and legend and history that has evolved around them. And then the festivals also bring concrete benefits to communities. So a lot of them happen in really rural places. And, when you have 40,000 visitors coming in and spending money at your hotels and your restaurants and your gas stations and all of that, that brings a real economic good to these communities. And then there's I think more spiritual goods, right? Building identity, building community, bringing families together. Those are all good things that I think we should all be doing more of. Those are affirmatively good aspects of these festivals. But animal festivals kind of put all of that good in conversation with the bad that is happening to animals. And I think one of the core questions of my research and of the book that I sort of wrestle with throughout the pages is, how do we balance that human good with the animal harm? I don't want to gloss over the human good. It is there and it is real. But at the same time, the animal harm is also real. It is there. It is happening every year. And more than that, it is teaching all of those kids, all of those families that attend those events, that treating animals in that exploitative way, in that unthinking way, is normal and good and fun. And I think those questions are what drew me to this project. It's what draws me to talk about it here to you all. And I think that, untangling some of our relationships with animals is one of the most complicated and pressing questions of our time. It undergirds so much of what we do as humans, from everything, just every day we all interact with these questions in ways we don't even think of. And animal festivals, because so many of us haven't thought about that topic in this way, I think is a good place to kind of start to untangle, what are our assumptions? Why did I assume the lobster festival would be less bad than the rattlesnake roundup? And let's talk about that. Let's interrogate that. It gives us a place to kind of ground our feet and start thinking about animals in a more rigorous way. So that is kind of what I have for you. I'll leave you with that. I'm happy to answer any questions. But thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm thrilled to be here. Yeah.
Just so involved, because you're also talking about this and animals, and I think it's really, really sweet. When you talk about your research and found work and all you mentioned, how much did this differ? Were these the same that or some of that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. It was such a joy to get to work on this. And like I said, she died when I was so young, so I never got to talk to her myself. So in some ways, kind of reading her notes and then thinking my own thoughts felt like a conversation that I could never have, But yeah, so my grandmother, she was looking at festivals all over the world, not just in the United States. So she had gone to there's a festival in Belgium where they throw cats off a roof. Now they do stuffed cats, but still. They hunt wrens in the United Kingdom. She ended up writing a whole book about that. She sort of got excited and thought there was more to say. And so she, I think, had a bigger scope in some ways and had, I think different kind of plans. None of her chapters were drafted. I have no idea what she would have written. All I had was, like I said, kind of like research files. So she, I think out of the 8 festivals that I focused on, I think she had gone to maybe 5 or 6 of them. And then the main lobster festival and the Iditarod I added because I thought they'd be kind of fruitful additions. The main lobster festival, both because of geography, I wanted something in the Northeast, and also because of species. I'm always trying to bring aquatic animals kind of into the conversation when I talk about animals, because there's so many, numbers wise, so many of them. So anyway, some of that was just a kind of a philosophical and strategic thought about how do I fill the missing holes in this book. Telling a narrative story. This book is written very narratively. I think my grandmother, like I said, would have done it much more anthology style. Yeah. Any other questions? Sure, hit me. That's a great question. There are a few kind of big categories. I'm going to start with your second one first. There's a few kind of big categories of festivals that I excluded for for lots of reasons. Okay, let me start again. There's a few categories of animal festivals that I did not include in this book, in part because I think they are so kind of like big and complex and have their own debates around them. So things like the rodeo, I didn't do a chapter on a rodeo. I didn't do chapters on like the Kentucky Derby, right? Like that I would call an animal festival. Horse racing is a huge animal festival, really expensive one, but it exists. Dog shows, professional shows like that. I absolutely would call an animal festival. You know, the Puppy Bowl that happens the same day as the Super Bowl, I would call that an animal festival. So I didn't include some of those like kind of more kind of defined categories, in part because I think when you're engaging with something that you've never heard of before, it's a lot easier to kind of ignore the like brain junk that accumulates about what we think about animals already. Like if you wanted to write a book about eating animals, say, like we all come with our own brain junk about what that looks like and what we kind of all the stuff that we're raised with. And everyone has their own kind of defensive posture about that topic. I wanted to focus on events that I thought people might either not have heard of or only heard of kind of obliquely, in order to kind of disarm people into having this conversation virtually while they read this book about animal festivals. And so I worried with things like the rodeo or dog shows or the horse races that there might be some sort of like a preconceived idea about it ahead of time. So that's your second question. Your first question, I think, is a really complicated one. So like, how do we move forward, basically? Do we like boycott these events? Do we change them? Like, what do we do with what's happening here? I think that the most successful things that I've seen throughout this research are places where people change. They didn't stop doing it. They didn't stop the event, excuse me. They stopped doing whatever was harming the animal. And so I'll give you two examples. One is the rattlesnake roundup in Sweetwater, Texas. They still kill the snakes. That is still the focus. But rattlesnake roundups happen all across the American South. And in Georgia, they have all now transitioned to be no-kill roundups. So they have the event, because like none of these events are just about this animal piece. I pulled out the animal piece for all of you and for my book, but they all have carnivals and fairs and gun shows and, flea markets, just like it's a big town kind of fair. And so all that stuff still happens in Georgia with these no-kill roundups. The only difference is they don't kill snakes. They have some snakes that they bring in from like educational exhibits, and they do some of that educational work of how do you safely interact with a rattlesnake? What are snakes? Like those types of questions they start engaging with in Georgia. And so that's an example where you could have the spirit of the event, you could honor the history of the event without kind of engaging in the harm anymore. And the other example is in the monarch butterfly, that like very sweet, clean event. They don't use butterflies anymore, but 100 years ago, or when the event started, I don't think it was 100, but it was close. They did. They captured monarchs and they would release them at sort of the peak of this pageant that they put on. And the monarchs would all burn up in the stage lights. They would just like kind of dissolve and die in the stage lights. And it horrified people. And within a few years that stopped. And then a few years ago, in like 2009, the grove where those butterflies actually migrate to, the real ones, they pruned it for human safety. They wanted humans to be able to walk in and out of this grove. And the very next year, the numbers of monarchs that returned to that grove they plummeted. It went down to like from, tens of thousands to like 5. Like the monarchs weren't safe there anymore. And so this town has this push and pull with sort of how do we honor these monarchs while we also like support their right to exist in this space. And so now, I think they've progressed to a point in this festival where it is much more reverential. It is more kind of like all the good without any of the bad. But I give you that example as like these paths aren't always linear and they're not always one-to-one, and yet progress can still be made. So I think what that looks like is, I think, up to each community to decide for themselves. So like, I don't know how you have a jumping frog contest without frogs. Like that's not for me to answer, but I think it is something that I hope those communities will meaningfully engage with as we hopefully move towards a more compassionate world. Did you want to ask your question?
See, I feel about less. I don't really even know why you mentioned the brain jump. I obviously have a preconceived notion that I'm about more thoughtful examples. So the hard base, I have no idea. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts about that. What you go to.
Yeah, I think that the type of festival, depending on the type of festival, I think that's true. So like I didn't find a lot of, I'm sure they exist. And of course, every time you say something, someone like pops up with some example that's like, but on the whole, I think, you know, the Northeast doesn't have a lot of those killing contests. A lot of those are concentrated in the American South, and Southeast, in Florida and those types of states. And but really, I was actually surprised in my research at the geographic diversity of these events. You know, it also, I think, depends on what you define animal festival, and I have a very broad definition. So things like, you know, like the lobster festival, I think a lot of people would not worry about, or there's like clam bakes, you know, barbecues. Like you can really kind of go down these rabbit holes of like, if we are all gathering around a body of an animal, like, is that an animal festival? So I think if you start pushing the boundaries a little, also there's a lot of like seafood festivals up here, like a lot of them. And that is like kind of a whole category in and of itself that, you know, I think counts, but isn't quite the same thing. That being said, I think that there's also a lot of festivals have, I think, because of that local history, it's part of how they kind of evolve as communities. And the Northeast, I think, has had I don't know, we just have a different kind of relationship with history here. We have a lot else kind of to focus on. Whereas I think in other communities and other times and places, animals were something that were more impactful to their kind of like day-to-day lives. If that's sort of my sense. I don't have empirical data for that, but yeah. Anything else? You guys? I did. I could not go to that because there was some reason it was in July. There was a reason I couldn't go. We lived in DC for a year and I don't think it would have made it into the book, but I did want to go. Do you have a follow-up about that? Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think that those events, I mean, there's so many of them. And some of this, like to do all of this travel was a little bit of a like matrix of like what weekends, like there was one month, I think it was March. My wife and I went to an animal festival every weekend. We left Friday after work, took a flight, we red-eyed home for a Sunday night and went back to work Monday morning. So some of it was just the game of what we could control. Yeah. Were you had a question too? I think that if you kind of push those categories, you know, absolutely. I think that I found them to be a helpful starting place to organize my thoughts around this. I think animal festivals, one of the problems with them, like I put up that map with like the 80 dots on it or whatever, is like they're so broad. They're so often small and broad across the country. Everyone has a different local history. Like I was struggling to think about how I could kind of compile them into a book that made sense. And so those categories were helpful for me to do that. I also believe that those categories are largely how we relate to animals out in the real world. I think you can call them something different, but I think often we eat animals, we kind of like chuckle at animals online, and then we have our pets, right? Like that's kind of how most of us interact with animals in broad strokes. And so I thought they were broad enough that they could cover a lot. That being said, a lot of festivals blur those lines, like the Iditarod I gave as an example. I think there's plenty of others that kind of cross pollinate. The Swallows Day Parade and Festival in California is one that I went to, but actually didn't make it into the book, in part because I thought it wasn't quite a clear enough picture of one of these categories. So they certainly do exist. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a question that my grandmother would have loved to engage with. And I did, I did a tiny bit. The monarch butterflies in that particular location, it absolutely like predates even like kind of like Western settlement. Like the native people there had their own relationship with the monarchs that lived in that grove. So in a literal way to your question, in a literal answer to your question, yes. But also I think there's like kind of broader question about like monarchs. Like humans have always kind of associated butterflies, not just in America, but in kind of Western history at least, with kind of like death, resurrection, kind of like the soul. And I put a couple examples in that chapter in the book to kind of get at this question of like, how deep does this run in our human psyche? And butterflies, I think, have absolutely that like religious connotation, and that idea of, you know, going into a tomb and coming back out 3 days later is obviously something we see reflected in Christian imagery. And it's something that I think other cultures too, kind of across the world, have seen as like the way butterflies fly. It's very like spectral. You'll hear that a lot in the, like if you start reading about butterfly symbolism. And that is like, kind of connects you almost without meaning to with like kind of past souls. And so that those echoes, I think, of kind of symbolism and what these animals mean to humans are absolutely there. And I think that is, you know, so there's like a broader answer to your question. And then the literal one, I think, is yes, people there did have engaged with butterflies in this way. And in the same way, I think communities who have migratory animals all over engage with their, you know, their planet mates. Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you all so much.